Stanford University.
Next week we have Ayman Sharma from Yahoo Research. He's going to be talking about how machine learning techniques can be applied to social media. And I'd like to introduce Fred Turner, Associate Professor from the Department of Communication here at Stanford. And take it away.
Hi, so I'm Fred Turner, and I'm delighted to be here. As I was saying to some folks at lunch, I'm a very serious fan of computer engineers. I'm a cultural historian by training, and I was raised intellectually in a world that focused on the cultural history of literature. And in that world, poets and novelists were the folks who changed culture. By the time I hit my 30s and the internet started sprawling across the world, it was pretty clear to me that computer engineers were the unacknowledged legislators of cultural change. And I'm delighted to be here and to be able to speak to a group of you. Before I get started, just a quick question. How many of you have actually been to Burning Man? Excellent. Okay, great. So so some of this will be familiar to some of you, and some it might be new for others. I'm going to make sure I give enough background for folks who haven't been. I'm going to make an argument today. I'm going to argue that the Festival of Burning Man constitutes something that I'm calling a cultural infrastructure for a new way of manufacturing. And that's going to be the core of the argument today. The notion that culture should be infrastructure is a little bit new. Culture is usually something that's seen as epiphenomenal. So, railroads, highways, that's infrastructure. Culture is something else. I think that's not the case anymore. I think we're living at a time where that's changing dramatically, and I want to sort of focus on that. I think I'll speak for about, 45 minutes or so, and then take questions. Does that make sense? Great. Okay, good. So I'll go direct through. Please, if you have any questions, just sort of points of order, points of clarification, please jump in. Otherwise, we'll have more extended time for questions in a little bit. So the talk today will have 4 parts. I'll talk first about the lobby at Building 43 at Google and its extreme strangeness about 2 years ago when I wandered in and saw pictures of people in loincloths spinning fire. Okay? And I'll tell you that story in a minute. The second part of the talk will focus on what Yochai Benkler, a scholar at Yale, has called commons-based peer production. In Benkler's articulation, this is a new mode of manufacturing. It's common to for-profit manufacturing, like Google, also to open-source modes of manufacturing, particularly in Linux. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to argue that Burning Man serves as a cultural infrastructure, an ideological resource, and a social resource for this new mode of manufacturing that's becoming increasingly important. I'll step back then and show how, in fact, engineers are migrating out into the desert in the tens of thousands every year to build high-tech art. And I'm going to make a case for why that might be so appealing to so many engineers. Finally, I'm going to argue in a little bit of theoretical depth that the festival literally serves as an infrastructure. And it serves as an infrastructure in 2 dimensions. One, it serves as a place where the ideas and ideologies around which particularly software manufacturing has become increasingly organized, and especially here in the Valley, can be celebrated and enjoyed. And second, it serves literally as a factory space for the manufacturing of new products for Google. We're going to talk about that. So those are the 2 things. Before I get going, anybody here actually working for Google at the moment? Okay, good. Thanks. That's another question I'm learning to ask as I give this talk. Google's been very open about it, and they've been very supportive, but at the same time, I'd like to know where I'm talking. A little context for this work. Like I said, I'm a cultural historian by training. A few years back, I published a book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. This book focused on Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth crew, Howard Rheingold, Kevin Kelly, and their phenomenal influence on how we think about computing. Not necessarily on computer design, but rather on what publicly we've thought computers were good for. And in the course of doing that book, I became fascinated by a long-term, 30, 40-year, in America, entwining of countercultural styles and technical worlds. Now, reviewers have said that, oh good, Turner finally told us the story of how hippies brought us computers. That's not what I think I did at all. I actually thought there's a different story, and it's in the book. And it's one in which researchers gathered around MIT in the 40s and 50s, for military research in particular, developed new collaborative styles simultaneously professional and social styles that migrated into the counterculture. And the counterculture then, again in the 80s, helped legitimate a new mode of computing. So I think the story was scientists, collaborative scientists, helped drive the rise of a countercultural style, which in turn legitimated a new generation of collaborative science in the 80s and onward. So, in the wake of doing that book, I pursued two projects. One tracing that history backward in time, which is on the left, and the other tracing it somewhat forward in time. So this is an art and technology collaboration actually in the 60s in New York. That's Robert Rauschenberg, the painter. That's Billy Kluver, a senior engineer with Bell Labs. I have a whole body of work tracing that collaboration. The part I'd like to talk with you about today is this part. This is the Burning Man Festival. This is 2006. That's a senior executive from Pixar and his sweetheart. And I want to talk today, I think, about the fusion of countercultural activity in the desert and manufacturing at Google. All right. So this thing that happened. It's about 3 years ago now. I was wrapping up the counterculture book, and I had spent a lot of time looking in the IBM archives. Beautiful pictures. IBM has put a lot of corporate pictures online. If you look at IBM and you look at computer worlds at IBM in the 50s and 60s, they're incredibly conservative. White men with white shirts, with white pocket protectors, and white women in little woolen A-line skirts serving them. I mean, sort of walking around. It's really quite a thing to see. It's extraordinarily conservative. In the executive offices, of course, what you see is the famous sign, think. You know, they really had that on their desks, think. My point here is that when I went to Google for the first time, having written this book and not knowing so very much about contemporary computing firms, I expected at the very least to enter a corporate lobby that was corporate. I expected blonde wood, a receptionist, you know, maybe something a little button-downish. On the contrary, when I walked in, this is about 3 years ago now, it's not true anymore, I just went and checked last week, what I found were 2 stories of photographs from the Burning Man Festival. And these are some of the photographs that I found. So here are men in tights, without shirts, riding around on bicycles with giant chandeliers apparently dropped from the sky. Here's a little house out in the middle of the desert. Okay, I'm thinking, right, okay, you know, remember, I've just come out of the archives, right? I'm thinking IBM, blonde wood, wool, suits. What is this about? Now, this is another image. This is taken by Waldemar Horvath, who's a programmer there at Google, very senior guy. That's a fire spinner. Fire spinning is a very common art form. For those who haven't been to Burning Man, that's the man there in the middle. The man is usually 40 to 60 feet tall. He's sort of a gender-neutral creature who is burned at the end of the week. I'll tell you more about the festival in a moment. So these images were up on the walls, and I was completely confused. I mean, why would America's leading search firm embrace this hippie festival? It made no sense to me at all. I started digging around a little bit, started Googling a little bit, and what did I find? But all kinds of connections. If you look now, some of you have computers, so you can. You look, you'll see that there are internal training seminars for Googlers to go out into the desert. So you can learn what to cook at Burning Man. That's, you know, that's part of your time, right? It's astonishing. In 1999, the entire firm of Google shut down so that the firm could go out to Burning Man. Okay, that was astonishing to me. They had a little Burning Man logo. It's still a famous logo. It's, you know, basically gone to Burning Man on the homepage. What's up with that? Okay. The ties get even more extreme. Larry and Sergey, and I love to say Larry and Sergey as if I actually know them. I don't. But it's just fun to say that, Larry and Sergey. All right. I can tell this is not a big laughing crowd. Kind of a serious crowd. All right. So anyways, Larry and Sergey go regularly, have gone for a very long time. And one of the great mysteries on the playa is the desert where it happens, is always, where's Larry? Where's Sergey? Well, yeah, all right. But one of the things that they did was they hired Eric Schmidt, in part because he too went to Burning Man. And that's an interesting phenomenon, you know, that you would hire a CEO who would go out to this festival. So the question that I came up with in the wake of my visit to the lobby was, how are these things connected? Why would a firm like Google embrace Burning Man? Why would so many burners be technologists? And the thesis that I developed and worked through in a paper that's available online is that there's a particular kind of manufacturing that's emerged, commons-based peer production, that it was especially powerful at Google, and that Burning Man serves as an ideological and structural support for that mode of manufacturing. So what is commons-based peer production? All right, this is a Yochai Benkler term. Benkler is a law scholar and sociologist, more or less, formerly at Yale, I think recently bought by Harvard. I'm glad, thank you for laughing at that one. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I've got to identify the ones who will laugh. That's good. Thank you. Yes, excellent. Benkler did a sociological study of, among other things, open source manufacturing, and made the case that computer networks make it possible to work together in collaborative teams that are geographically distributed, that feature people who are at least culturally peers, if not skill level peers or professional peers, and that collaborate on projects that don't necessarily, in that moment, make a profit. So open source software. A lot of folks work on open source software. How many of you have worked on an open source software project? Excellent, great. How many of you were paid for your labors? Fascinating. Thanks, great, yeah. Isn't that interesting? I always love that moment. It's great. Yeah, some animals are more equal than others. But that's very interesting, right? Because lots of people contribute, and people get different things from it. They get, they might get reputation, they might learn something, they might get a friendship. There's a lot you can get from it other than just cash. Wikipedia would be a classic example of commons-based peer production, as would some elements of online multiplayer gaming. The key point here, and I'll come back to this, is that word commons. Somewhere there's a central space, whether it's in cyberspace in a kind of shared electronic space, or actually in a physical space, as it will be at Google in a moment, where this work is getting done. The other key word is peer. Okay, peer, meaning, equal. As I'm going to suggest in a moment, some animals are indeed more equal than others. Okay, for Benkler, this is very specifically a computer network-driven phenomenon. My own work shows a somewhat different trajectory. I would argue that it's in fact a new stage in white-collar labor, white-collar production. And it spreads across industries, and computers support it, engage it, promote it, help it, but are not necessarily an exclusive driving force. In the 1980s and 1990s, all sorts of firms disaggregated. They broke apart. You might have expected in the 50s and 60s to have a lifetime job with a firm. In the 80s and 90s, many of those firms disaggregated. You would work for them for a while and then go work for another firm. Alongside that disaggregation, you saw the rise of project-based, temporary labor. You might work on a project for a year, 2 years, but at the end of that, you were done. You were there for a project, you'd have to go find another project somewhere else. That kind of work, of course, favors a young, flexible, note the quotation marks, labor force. It also favors the development of offices that support the social lives of young people. Offices that are playful, fun, easy to meet and hang out with other people in, easy to stay late at, comfortable. Okay. So I want to argue that this is a new mode of manufacturing, and that it's not simply at open source software or Wikipedia, but is in fact a new way of working across the board. All right. I'm going to exercise my inner sociologist here. Structure. Structure is really key here. Commons-based peer production requires 5 things to work in any setting. The first thing that it requires is a commons. There has to be a space, a physical space or a digital space where people can meet and do stuff together. And it has to be more or less equally open to everybody. Okay? A commons. Second, commons-based peer production projects almost always have hyper-leveled management structures. There might be someone who's in charge of a kernel, for example, on Linux. There might be someone who's known as the go-to guy on some particular way of coding. But there won't be more than a couple of layers. It's really people collaborating. There isn't a hierarchy. It isn't like IBM in 1957, where there might have been 7 layers of management between Watson in charge and a programmer down here. Okay. The other thing that's really important is that there is interpersonal visibility. You have to know what the other people are doing. And you have to know something about them as people. You have to know, oh yeah, Bob's really good at that kind of code, but he's such a persnickety guy. Or, you know, Jean's really sharp, but she's always late. You need to have that kind of knowledge about people, because so much of the work being done is being done in this sort of very collaborative, very loose, very not monitored manner. So people need to be able to see each other, recognize each other's talents and skills, and market their own talents and skills to other folks. Another thing that commons-based peer production requires is subsidy. This is one of the things that we never talk about, particularly at Burning Man. Subsidy, you have to have money coming in from somewhere else to let you do work for free. Okay? If you work for free on an open source software project, that's great. You'll learn things, but somebody else has got to be paying your bills, or you've got to have money coming in from somewhere else so that you can pay those bills. Many years ago, about 30 years ago, I was a freelance journalist in Boston. And one of my favorite hustles was when a famous magazine or newspaper would say to you, oh, you know, it's great that you want to write that article for us. I mean, I'm sorry we won't be able to pay you, but imagine the prestige you'll get from having, you know, X clip. All right. You know, so I'm not sure that's going on here, but those magazines were depending on my having a subsidy. So too here, in many open source worlds, people are subsidized, sometimes directly by their companies, given a day or two a week to work on an Apache project, for example, on a Linux kind of project, or sometimes indirectly. Might be teenagers, you know, in school, fed by mom and dad, and coding in the evening. Finally, commons-based peer production requires a communal ethos. You have to have a way of thinking about each other that is community-based, not for-profit based. You have to have a way to feel good about each other and not get all tangled up in competition, in you stole my idea, you stole my idea, you stole my code, you stole my code. You need a communal ethos. So I've written a lot about this, and I'll spare you the long story, but one of the things that fascinates me most about Howard Rheingold's term, virtual community, is that inside virtual communities, there's a lot of community work, interpersonal sociability, relationship making, but there's also a lot of professional work. Exchange of information, exchange of code, exchange of money. And those two things go together. And this, I think, is an enormously powerful feature of commons-based peer production. A communal ethos makes it possible for people who have a lot of something in one register, like humor, to trade that humor with folks who may have something in a lot of other registers, like really great coding chops. So maybe you're going to teach me a coding trick because I'm funny. And I'm going to tell you a joke because you're going to help me with that coding trick. My point is that in these worlds, there are multiple schemes of value, multiple types of value, and that a communal ethos, a sense that we're all a community together, makes it possible to trade value across those things, which might not otherwise be tradable. By way of example, if I said to you, I'll trade you a joke for a piece of code, would you do that in this environment?
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Excellent. He's not a plant. But I think what I'm trying to say is in a more formal environment, right? Like if my boss here at Stanford tried to pay me in humor, that's not working for me. Okay? But in a community, right? I mean, I'm happy to, like, you know, be funny, maybe make a little, you know what I mean? Okay, so communal ethos is key. All right, Linux, for instance, thrives on gifts to the community. Many, many people give. The community grows. People take from the gift pile differentially. Some people get friends. Some people get skills. And some people who maybe know Linus get to be part of Red Hat and get to be part of a public offering. All right. Excuse me, my Marxist credentials are showing. All right. Google engineering very much has the features of a commons-based peer production operation. They have a leveled management. If you ask folks at Google who are managers, what's it like to be a manager, they say, well, I'm not really a manager. I'm an engineer first. You hear that again and again. Engineers rule, okay, at Google. There are layers of management, but there are surprisingly few. You really can get to Larry and Sergey and Eric pretty quickly if you need to and if you have a project that works. Google is also exceptionally effective at creating many kinds of commons. If you've been to the firm in its Mountain View offices here, you know that there's the open air dining area, There are a whole series of dining spaces across the firm. You'll also know that offices are famously and deliberately too small, and that they cram people in 2 and 3 at a time. It's Google. They could afford private offices. But they don't want private offices because private offices cease to be commons. In a crammed-in 3 space, you gotta know what the other guys are doing. And that's powerful. That's valuable. That creates a commons. You watch each other. It creates interpersonal visibility. The other way that Google creates commons, and I didn't know about this until I started interviewing folks there, was they create online commons. There are mailing lists that are incredibly important. And they're at varying levels of specificity. You can mail to the whole company, not the best move for a new engineer. You can mail to subgroups. You can mail to people who have a community affiliation, dog lovers. On those lists, you can circulate ideas and you can develop products very rapidly. I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. Google also functions on interpersonal visibility. It's funny, I have spent a fair amount of time over there, and each time I go, I feel like I'm going back to high school. But it's like a really smart high school, where everybody's really nice, really rich, and really smart. You know what I mean? And you go to the cafeteria, and it's not just like, it's not just like the plump lady in the white dress. It's a really good chef. Would you like lobster today? Okay. In that kind of space, people are watching each other, and they're watching each other carefully. There's a lot of glancing around the room. And interpersonal visibility is something that carries value there. Google also very explicitly subsidizes its engineers, though not other kinds of workers. 20% time. Engineers are offered 20% of their time to ostensibly do whatever they want. They can just go be creative. Okay? Now, as it turns out, Marissa Mayer has reported that in a 2006 study of products developed in the first half of 2006, more than 50% of the products developed in that period emerged out of 20% time work. That's fascinating to me. Okay, more than half of Google's products from the first half of 2006 came out of 20% time projects. Yeah?
How many products do they make in half of a year?
I don't know, and that's a great question. I'm not sure how she was defining product. I think what she was defining was projects that turned into projects. And I'll talk about one of those in a moment. But I don't actually know that number. Great.
You know what percentage of engineers take 20% time?
No. And that would be, I think, almost impossible to get, because I wasn't getting any help at the corporate level. And Google's famously closed-mouthed about this kind of demographic information. As I asked people how many of them actually took it, everybody said they did. But I said, so what do you do with it, right? And some of them actually did stuff that was not for Google, but many more had things that were sort of maybe also for Google. So it was a very blurry area. It was a very, very blurry area. Does that help answer your question? Okay, great, good. Alrighty, onward. The communal ethos. Communal ethos at Google gets expressed very much in the architecture and in the offices. You can bring your dog. Lots of people do. You can make an office that looks like a home. You can stay there all night. You've got coffee. You've got latte on every floor. You've got a massage chair if something starts to ache. Okay? This isn't just a company. This isn't IBM. Don't put on your public self. Bring your whole private self to work. Be here in this private space together. All right. This is a very powerful manufacturing mode. Just a brief story, I think, to show how this works within Google. In the wake of 9/11, an engineer named Krishna Bharat was searching for news. He found about 15 sites. He wrote a script to aggregate those sites and make it possible for people to see several sources of news simultaneously. And he circulated that script on a company listserv as a gift to the Google community. He said, hey, I'm really interested in tracking news about 9/11, thought you might be too, here's how you can do it. Okay, Marissa Mayer and some other folks were watching that list just because it was part of the community, and they spotted a product that could be developed. Google News. They built a product team and developed Google News very, very rapidly in a period of several months. And I think that's a powerful innovation mode. Here's somebody doing something on his own time who, because he believes he's part of a community, believes he's part of a community of peers, loosely throws out an idea at very low risk. I mean, nobody's really going to worry about it if it doesn't fly. It's just a gift, it's just coming out to the community. Very low risk, but very high value. The community can see it because of the interpersonal visibility. He has time to do it because he's subsidized. and the gift itself becomes a Google product. Ironically, one on which they at least officially don't make any money to this day by choice, which I think is really interesting. Okay. So, how does Burning Man connect to this? I'm going to make a case that Burning Man does two things. Burning Man is, on the one hand, a social prototype. And this is a term I've started using for social worlds that explicitly model a set of ideals that can be ported into other places. Think of them as practice worlds, worlds where you can practice being something that you might want to be somewhere else, but you're not sure. You know, you can practice being a certain kind of person at Burning Man that if you actually practiced it in other parts of your life might not work so well. Okay, likewise, you can practice styles of working together at Burning Man that are very powerful. So it's a social prototype. It's a prototype of a different kind of world that includes commons-based peer production. It's a world with the individual self at its center. And it's a world consisting of information, technology, and sociability outside the marketplace. It's explicitly a space where people are outside the marketplace. I'll say more about that in a moment. However, Burning Man also serves as infrastructure in a second sense. It can be an actual factory space in which new products are developed, and people who are participating in Burning Man for personal reasons may actually serve as product developers, and in this case, in the case of Burning Man Earth, for Google. And I think that's a fascinating story. So what's Burning Man? You know, let me just take a moment, because there are burners in the audience. And, you know, I'll give the sociological definition in a minute, but I'd just be really curious. Folks who've been to Burning Man, what is it?
Make your own festival.
A make your own festival. Excellent. Okay, great. How many people are out there?
50,000?
Yeah, we're north of 40 this last year, I think. Yeah. Last time I went, which was 2007, I think it was 35,000. A ton of people. What's it feel like to be out there?
Fun.
Yes. But also hot, right?
During the day, yeah.
Yeah, during the day it's really hot. Okay, great. Yeah, is that a hand? No. Okay. What else? Yeah.
Yeah. Anywhere you go, you are surrounded by evidence of people's creativity.
Yes.
And pretty soon your mind starts to boil, and you can't think of anything but things you could make, and you can't wait to do it.
That's really, thank you. That's really exactly it. You are surrounded by creativity. It's an amazing sensation. The first time you're out there, speaking for myself, I almost trembled with it. It was just sort of astonishing. Everyone makes something. So you have a massive city. This is an overview, actually, of the city in 2000, I believe, in 5. The man stands at the center of the city, in that central area. Then you have a horseshoe-shaped city. Each of these is a block. These are streets with names. And people have camps inside those blocks. Okay, so you're camped out with your friends or alone or whatever in one of those blocks. But one of the conditions of Burning Man is that you have to contribute something to the community. And people take that pretty seriously. And people get very creative. People make costumes, they make wild tents, they make giant art cars. They're wonderful art cars. You drive around at night. People make cars that look like dinosaurs. I rode in one that looked like a Mayan god. There are giant double-decker buses that have been turned into ships that sail across the desert in the middle of the night. The great thing about the art cars, they're all public transportation. If they have space, they have to stop and pick you up. And it's wonderful. You meet people in the most amazing ways out there. You can't turn around without bumping into somebody's idea of something cool. You may not always agree that it's cool, but boy, it's interesting. Great. Other thoughts for folks who've been out there? Other thoughts? What else is it? What else is it? Yeah.
It's the closest thing to another planet. Like it feels like an alien culture, or more like the mixing of a million alien cultures.
Okay, which cultures have you seen mixed out there?
Raver culture, New Age culture, Silicon Valley tech culture.
Yeah.
Very primitive culture, very high tech culture.
Yeah, it's a wild thing, isn't it? I mean, really, pretty much every kind of culture mixes out there. It's really, really something. I've seen, fancy executives in really expensive RVs parked next to the outdoor whipping station. Like, what do you do with that? The flagellation fun spot. I mean, I don't know. It's like, okay. That's when I knew I couldn't take my children out, even though I love the place. So Burning Man was founded in 1986 by Larry Harvey, who was a landscaper and a friend. And they went down to Baker Beach in San Francisco, and they burned a wooden man. It's kind of apocryphal. I've actually interviewed Larry to ask how that happened, and he doesn't actually remember. He's not entirely sure. I mean, there are stories that it was, about marking the end of a relationship, marking the changing of the seasons. There are a lot of stories about it, and he doesn't know, so we probably won't know. The point is that a small crowd gathered, and they did it again the next year, and again the next year, again on Baker Beach. And each year more folks would come, and it would be the same time of the year. Eventually, the Park Service got tired of this and said, guys, you just can't do this here anymore. And so I believe it was in 1990, 1991, correct me if I'm wrong, they went out to the desert in Nevada with members of the Cacophony Society. The Cacophony Society is an anarchist art group in San Francisco. A lot of fun, definitely worth Googling, even better worth doing. And so somewhere between 60 and 80 people went out into the desert. And famously, they drew a line in the sand and hopped over that line. And once they were over that line, the rules of the everyday world ceased applying. To give you a sense of what that time was like, I actually have a report from that period, and I just want to read you a little bit of who was out there then. So this is 1995. And this is one visitor talking. He says, there are all sorts of people here. It's a living, breathing encyclopedia of subcultures. Desert survivalists, urban primitives, artists, rocketeers, hippies, deadheads, queers, pyromaniacs, cybernauts, musicians, ranters, eco-freaks, acid heads, breeders, punks, gun lovers, dancers, S&M and bondage enthusiasts, nudists, refugees from the men's movements, anarchists, ravers, transgender types, and New Age spiritualists. Wow. And it's, a lot of that's still out there. It's an amazing conglomeration of people, really just incredible. Very, very powerful and diverse. By the late 1990s and then on into the aughts, the numbers got simply huge. The first time I went out, it was north of 30,000. The last time I went out, it was just north of 40. That's a lot of people in the desert. There's no money that changes hands out there except in a couple of places. First, you have to buy a ticket. Tickets, was it $375 last time? Somewhere in there, $375. And you can buy coffee and ice on site, and that's it. Otherwise, you have to bring everything with you. Okay. Great question. It goes towards the infrastructure in the organization. So there's actually a team, there's a series of teams. There's something called the Burning Man organization that does things like go out, build some parts of the city, lay out the city, manage relations with the Park Service. This is actually in the Black Rock Desert, which is a national park area. And so they have to deal with the Park Service. And then there's a lot of cleanup as well, as you might imagine. So the art grants are a fairly new thing. Some of the money is going to art grants. The Burning Man Arts Organization has been around for, 7 years maybe? 5-7 years. It has not paralleled the development of the whole firm. And parenthetically, there's a book on this that I want to recommend by Catherine Chen. It's a book it's called, Organizing Chaos is what it's called. Spectacular book about the organization itself and how it works. But yes, some money does go to art grants. It's not a huge amount. It's on the order of about 150,000 if I'm right. And that's not actually huge money at the end of the day. When you go to Burning Man, you're introduced very quickly to the 10 principles. These are principles that are circulated on the web page, circulated in pamphlets when you get there, and that you're reminded of. These are the 10 principles of the event. I won't walk through all of them, but I do want to flag the ways in which they celebrate the values of commons-based peer production. We don't exchange money here. Rather, we give each other gifts. We're inclusive. Everyone can come. And we have a communal ethos because we're making a communal effort. We all participate. Nobody just watches. And we do it immediately. We are radically self-expressive, but we are also radically self-reliant. And I would argue, as many of you would know from working and living here, self-reliance is a key feature of the new economy that we live in. You better be self-reliant if the company's not giving you a job for 40 years. Okay. Peer production dominates Burning Man, and it's in fact what creates that feeling of ubiquitous creativity that really is the place. People go out in camps. Often these camps have themes. They can have names like Tiki Camp or Antique Table Camp or trying I think my favorite is Fast Furniture. I'm very loosely affiliated with Fast Furniture. They very kindly let me hang with them for a while. They drive around in motorized cupcakes, which are really pretty wonderful until you're my size. These are little cupcakes, okay? But they're really incredible. When you see a swarm of cupcakes driving across the desert in the middle of the night, it's just the best, right? It's just the best. Okay. So there are theme camps, and the theme camps tend to make engineered art projects. So you know, Burning Man is ostensibly open to all kinds of art, but the truth is there's very little on-canvas painting out there. There's a lot of technologically driven artwork. Light shows, automobiles, fun drive-around things, gizmos. You know, there's the Flaming Lotus Girls are one of my favorites. They make a giant dragon that spits fire in sync with music. So you're hearing this music and there's just incredible. There's fire spinning, there's dancing. So this tends to be made by camps, and they do this artwork together. When they do the art projects, they get to fuse, I want to argue, 3 features of the technological world that maybe don't get as much attention as they should. First off, social networking. You meet people making stuff together. Now, despite the 10 principles, I want to say that when people found out that I was a Stanford professor on my first time out there, they started giving me business cards. I'm actually serious about this. This was a peculiar experience because I had gone out not expecting that. And I left the playa after my first season out there with more cards than I'd ever had. And, you know, like from a conference or something. People would take me out in the back and they'd say, hey, you know, I've got this project going. Let me tell you about it a little bit. It was fascinating because I really hadn't expected that. Okay. So there's a lot of social networking. Some of it's just social, some of it's business. Like virtual community, it's a world where the social and the professional are entwined. There's a tremendous amount of work going into identity production. You produce yourself on the playa as a character. It's the most wonderful experience. It can be very liberating if you can be a character of a kind that you might not be able to be in your home world. I actually went sort of hyper-sociologist. I went out in khakis and a white button-down shirt. This offended some people out there, but I did the best I could. You'll know if you work at Stanford that if you do research with human subjects, you have to have an IRB clearance. I had to have an IRB clearance. I had to hand out a pre-interview form. So I thought, you know, I'll dress the part. It'll be good. It'll be good. But people are producing identities, wearing costumes, practicing things that they might not practice at home. One of my favorite senior Googlers has a cowboy outfit that he wears out there that involves extensive leather chaps. Not the kind of thing he can wear so much at home. These things, I think, are part of a larger experience that I've given a name to that I kind of like. It's the name vocational ecstasy. People on the playa often have an ecstatic experience of collaborative creation. It's ecstatic. It's wonderful. Finally, they can join together in projects that are meaningful to them, that are expressive, and that are totally consuming. And I think this is a particularly important feature because I think that actually tech worlds in the professional setting promise vocational ecstasy, promise the chance to express oneself in professional terms, but don't actually deliver very often. Far too often, the cubicle world looks more like Dilbert than like Burning Man. Yeah. Okay. So let me tell a story about one of the groups that does this. And I want to actually tell it in 2 parts. First, I want to talk about a guy named Greg McNichol. Greg McNichol is a 55-year-old computer animator who I've interviewed. He's gone out for many, many years. In 2006, he joined a team to develop a pyrotechnic event for Black Rock City, the home of Burning Man, that year. And it was a pretty intense, explosive event. And he said, part of the fun is having a dream about something, building it, seeing it work. Seeing it work is just a real high. The pyrotechnic team, he said, were people like me, very focused, very few words, open to anything, no egos. We worked very tightly as a team, and we were open to very intense, focused energy in the whole team. I loved the feeling of flow on the team. It was obsessive, it was exciting, and we weren't taking care of our physical needs. Listen to this. This guy has disappeared into his work. And he says, you know, he's an animator, right? And he says, you know, in some ways this is like working on a Hollywood film crew. And I said, well, okay, but what's different, right? I mean, you could get this at home. Why go to the desert? He says, out here, I'm in charge. It's my project. I'm creative. in his experience of working on the pyrotechnic team, he was able to immerse himself in the team, feel totally a part of the team, have that ecstatic experience of immersion, of flow around building a technological device, an experience that was not available to him in Hollywood, even though all the other parts of it were, and perhaps the promise of being a creative individual might have been. In Hollywood, as I interviewed him and discovered at some length, he may be a very creative guy, but he's a creative guy who has to fill a particular creative niche. His full creativity is not something that his company wants. They want him to draw some stuff. Okay. All right, the mad scientists. The mad scientists are a really, really interesting group. They're led by Tim Black, who is a computing systems engineer here in the Valley. They've been around since 1998. They've built a number of major art installations on the playa. And they've recently gotten grants from the Burning Man Arts Organization. Black says that they work with a core of about 10 to 12 people, and then a cloud of about 100 people who work off and on with them all the way across the year. They turn Black's house into a staging area, and it's a pretty amazing thing. In 2006, they built something called the L3K light system, which is a ring of plastic-encased LED lights that ran through the sand around the man. And my picture doesn't make this visible at all, but if you imagine that man standing on top of a tower, imagine a ring of lights all the way around, maybe 500 yards out from the man. Those are designed to keep people back, partly from when the man burns. You don't want people running into a burning man. So, he gathered this team. He worked on it. He said, yeah, it was great. It was a collective. It was a meritocracy. He said, we were mostly pretty hardcore geeks. Those are his words, not mine. He said, it's great. We're open to new members, and when a new member exhibits a skill, we exploit it, and it's great. Okay. The technology here, at least from my perspective, was fairly sophisticated. They had to mold plastic. They had to transport hundreds of pounds of gear and sophisticated wiring out into the desert and get it set up and working. The project ran $20,000 over budget, and like a good production team, the members of the team ate the money. They didn't go back to Burning Man and ask for more money. They just said, we contracted with them for a small figure, and we're going to have to just eat this. They behaved like a high-end production team, but they did it for free, and they did it because they loved it. They did it, I would argue, for vocational ecstasy. And I think that's a very, very powerful experience. And this, I think, is where Burning Man does what a sociologist named Bennett Berger called ideological work. Ideological work is what groups do when there's a fissure, a fracture between what they say they're doing and what they're actually doing. That fracture needs to be repaired. And that repair work is ideological work. I would argue that at places like Google or other firms, perhaps other firms more distinctly, there's a fracture between the actual experience of working as a computer programmer in a cubicle, feeling like a creative person, but still operating within corporate constraints, and that larger rhetoric of, don't be evil, we're changing the world through the making of information, we're creative, we're playful, you can have your whole life here and it will be a creative and good life. And I think that tension gets managed in part by the experience of vocational ecstasy in the desert. You can act out at Black Rock City, you can act out the values that underpin a lot of the work that you're doing at a place like Google. You can act out collaborative teamwork. You can act out total immersion in the project. You can act out creative artistry. I asked one programmer why he went to Burning Man. He builds extensive sculptures on the playa. He says, well, he's a very, very well-known and effective programmer who asked not to be named. So I said, so why, what do you get out of this, right? What do you need this for? And he says, well, when I program, people don't see me do it. They don't see it. But when I make this sculpture and it's cool, everybody tells me about it. They see it. That's a powerful moment for that person. Okay. The second thing that Burning Man does is it literally serves as a manufacturing space. Information technology is I think, a really interesting development in the history of manufacturing. Because at one level, right, it's got a very material element. I mean, I need to mine aluminum and get a bunch of minerals together. I have to grind glass. But at another level, it's almost pure mind share. It's ideas that can be expressed in bits and bytes. And in part because of that, work can be done in many different places by many different kinds of people all of a sudden. And one of them is Burning Man. And the value comes from the creativity there. Let me show, let me just flip to a space where I can tell this story properly. There it is. OK. So in 2000, a painter named Andy Johnstone, who's been going to Burning Man for a long time, had created something called a virtual playa. He'd used a Microsoft flight simulator and created a virtual model of the city. You could sort of fly in through the virtual model, and it was pretty neat. In 2006, a guy named Rod Garrett, who is the person who has been long responsible for laying out the city, giving it its space, wanted to sort of play with Google Earth Maps. And so he started doing that. And he went to Johnstone, and then he also went to Google and said, hey, can we make a Google Earth map that connects the virtual playa stuff to it? Google sent an airplane and a photographer out over the city. That's where that picture comes from, at Google's expense. And today, the images that they created are part of the Google Earth project. Okay. Since that time, Garrett, Johnstone, and some programmers named Michael Faber and Jahai Stewart have worked with Google Earth and the Google Earth team to develop what they hope will be a digital portal to Black Rock City, the home of Burning Man, and a beta space for developing new tools for Google Earth. Now think about this for a minute. Their particular dream, and at least this is from Johnstone now, is to develop an interactive map. Imagine if you can go to Google Earth, fly down, and visit the camps, and there would be avatars standing there waiting to talk with you. This is actually what they're trying to develop, okay? So imagine that. It's a pretty neat thing. Imagine Google Maps and Google Earth with an interactive element. Okay, the burners want to develop this for their burner process, but the products would actually belong to Google. So far, there's no money changing hands. And listen carefully, I think, here to the logic. This is Rod Garrett. We're working in the spirit of cooperation and comradeship and good faith, and I don't see any reason to change that. That's the spirit of Burning Man, and much of Google also. It's not being handled with lawyers and accountants. That's that communal ethos in action. The power of Google is that they don't do all the work, he said. People posting content do. The same is true here at Burning Man. Citizens create the vast majority of things. This is that commons in action. The commons is creating value. At the same time, though, these guys really do hope to turn Black Rock City citizens, Burning Man citizens, into a development team for Google. This is Andy Johnstone. He says they expect Google, quote, to use our piece of desert as a petri dish. Once burners start hacking Burning Man Earth, he said, Google will get, quote, content they never dreamed up in 1,000 sushi power breakfasts. Okay, that's amazing to me. These guys are going to develop for pleasure a product that Google can monetize and send out into the world for profit. They may get pleasure from it, like a Linux programmer gets pleasure from it, an open source contributor gets pleasure from it. But at the end of the day, Johnstone's going to be a painter. And Google's going to have much more money. Okay. All right, so to sum, how might Burning Man and Google be related? They could both just be products of Bay Area culture. This would explain how they came about at the same time and some of their structural similarities. I'm inclined to believe they are both harbingers of a new mode of manufacturing. And I'm willing to debate this at some length, and I hope we will. And if they are, then Burning Man is a form of cultural infrastructure. In a world where value is generated through information and information goods, culture becomes newly and terribly important. It is not just an epiphenomenon. Culture is what brings us Hollywood. Culture is what brings us Facebook. Burning Man offers ideological support for imagining engineering as the building of an ideal world populated by ideal selves. It helps us imagine engineering as art. It helps us feel jazzed in just the way you described it, by the idea that we too can be creative. It's a very empowering thing. It's also a very valuable thing. It's both of those things at the same time. It's also, in a very sociological sense, a structural support. It offers opportunities for social and professional network building that are very real. I can meet people in the desert who I might not meet in other parts of my life, and I can meet them during a time of interpersonal vulnerability that makes us both interesting to one another outside the professional domain. finally, I think, at least in the case of Burning Man Earth, it can actually be a manufacturing space.
You mean by interpersonal vulnerability?
Sure. I can tell I've been alone with the books too long. I mean that if you're walking around in a dress with a beer in your hand, and the other guy approaches you and he's wearing chaps and he's just come back from a dance, parts of you are in play in that social moment that wouldn't be in play in an office. And I know more of you and more about you than I would if we met, for example, in a venture capitalist's office. Does that make sense? That's all I meant. Great. So that's what I brought, and I look forward to questions. And that's a
Why'd you
sculpture.
stop going?
Pardon?
Why'd you stop going?
Why did I stop going? Great. Mostly I went for research. And after a couple of times, I'd kind of felt like I'd kind of done it. I'd gotten what I'd gotten out of it. I do think about going back every year. If I do go back, it will be because I find a camp that I want to spend more time with. So a lot depends for me now on the camp. If I can find a good camp that I'd like to be a part of, that's great. Otherwise, I'll probably not go for a while. Yeah. Yeah, right in the front.
So I actually have two questions.
Okay.
What's like this mix of cultures? Have things ever gotten out of hand?
Have things ever gotten out of hand with?
I don't know, just craziness.
Oh, in Burning Man? Oh.
I'm like,
Yeah.
in a dangerous sense.
Sure.
Altamont.
Altamont, absolutely. Altamont, absolutely. So Bohemian cultures have routinely gotten out of hand. Altamont, things got very nasty. Here at Burning Man, things got out of hand in the 90s, and in part because of that, a couple people were killed. They were run over by cars. One person was shot. Because of that, it's actually quietly but quite thoroughly regulated now. There's several different kinds of police out there, and there's also a volunteer police force called the Black Rock Rangers, and they all work to keep it from getting too far out of hand. But I would say that things routinely get out of hand at Burning Man, routinely get a little dangerous, but often do it in a smaller space that's not visible to the whole. If you get dangerous in public, the police come.
And then my other question was, so basically what you can almost say about Burning Man is that it kind of emphasizes sometimes that when we're in our jobs and in public, we act and dress sometimes based on what we know other people are expecting of us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think so. I think one of the most important features of Burning Man and of Google, and I think a kind of deep social trend that they represent, is an increasing personalization or desire to personalize our work worlds. I think we've wanted, at least since the 1960s, to bring more and more of ourselves, our creative selves, our whole selves, our emotional selves, into every part of our lives, into the whole of our everyday life. Now, on its face, that sounds like a great thing. I can be more myself for more of the day. That's a wonderful thing. I have actually started to argue in print that it's a bad thing. I actually just wrote an article in defense of bureaucracy. I know, I feel like I should be ashamed, but I'm not. Because if you start bringing your whole self into life, you start organizing labor and the distribution of resources around labor in terms set by culture. Within Burning Man, for example, it's very hard to be, I would argue, some kinds of black. You can be African American, skin color-wise. There's no prejudice in that sense at all. But you won't hear a lot of dark hip-hop. You won't hear gangster rap. You'll hear techno, but you won't hear gangster rap. The first year I was out there, there was actually a small tent, the Soul Tent, that was a protest tent. It played old soul music to protest that fact. I find that really, really interesting, right? Now, I love it that there was a Soul Tent. That was totally great. But when you organize the distribution of resources by culture, then you don't have a way to protest the misdistribution of resources. All you get is, what, you don't like the way I'm doing it? That's not cool, man. If cool is your criteria for organization, right, it's very hard to challenge stuff. And so that's a thing. So bureaucracy is a place where rules can legislate the interaction and distribution of resources across many different kinds of people, and that's why I like it. I didn't mean to go off on that riff, but yeah, in the back.
Question about applying this in other places. Google's fairly well known for its affiliation with Burning Man. Where else do you see this showing up in other digital media companies, cities, etc.?
Sure, I have a long answer, but I think you might have an answer. Were you going to answer that question?
Yeah,
that's what I wanted to share. I'm a librarian over at the Stanford Library, but I'm a software engineer there.
Yep.
And I'm part of this thing that we call the Code for Lib hive mind.
Proving yet again that the library is the coolest place on campus.
Well, it is. But the thing is, software engineers who work in libraries tend to be sort of isolated because libraries don't have a lot of software engineers. They typically have 2 or 3, right? So you need a larger community. So we all hung out in an IRC chat room for about a decade and created this thing that we thought of as the hive mind. And then we thought, oh, it'd be cool to get together every year. So now we have this very unofficial conference every year that's totally word of mouth, community organized. It's been great. On the one hand, it's been by far the most valuable place to get training. It's where so many new ideas and software projects have emerged from. It's where a lot of friendships that later grow on to become business partnerships or new jobs come from. But we're hearing a lot of the same criticisms. I mean, it's really hard now to become a software engineer in the library sphere without being friends with all of the people who go to Code for Lib and hanging out and drinking beer with us. And if that's not your thing,
then it's a challenge. So one thing that has surprised me about Burning Man, but I think is indicative for its moment culturally, and this is a good example of it, is it's gone international. There are burns around the world now, have been for a decade. Companies in Germany, Sweden, and Denmark, 3 I happen to know about personally, send their executives to Burning Man for training in creativity, which I find completely amazing. You know, I was really surprised when I was doing some of my research to see corporate teams depicted at Burning Man, right? You know, like, so it's like a corporate offsite. You know, it's like, let's get together and wear pink fur. Like I'm serious, that's a corporate offsite now for some firms, okay? That's absolutely amazing to me. So it has gone global very powerfully.
Again, any other companies or cities that you see this also showing up in?
Which parts of it? Connected to Burning Man or connected to common space peer production?
Let's say common space peer production, but I think that just the creative community where creativity may be one of the highest principles for running the company.
Right. Okay. So Richard Florida would argue that in fact the creative class has bubbled up across America in virtually every thriving metropolis, right? And you know, he's right, I think, in a lot of senses. So you would see some of the things that I've just described, and burners involved in finance in New York, for example. That's one place where I know I've been actually in touch with folks, believe it or not, Wall Street. You see them all through academe. You see them in a lot of tech firms, certainly open source of tech firms, anything having to do with Apache. So I guess I would see it tech, finance. Any other firms stand right out for you guys?
IDEO. IDEO has
right, thank you.
talks.
Right. IDEO, in fact, actually I did a lot of my interviews at IDEO actually before I went out, right. IDEO's design firms more broadly are totally engaged with this, yeah.
Pixar.
Pixar, excellent, Pixar, right, yep.
So the balance that you bring between creative software. There's a lot of open source software projects which fail, which never get off the ground. And I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of social experiments like Burning Man which never get off the ground. Do you see any reasons why some things succeed, some things fail in the Burning Man?
Great question. So the question was, just for folks who are in the back, why do some kinds of projects succeed, some kinds of projects fail in the Burning Man sphere? It's really interesting. I think that to succeed, you need a couple of things. And I have in the book, I have a fairly dry, fairly abstruse, but also fairly rigorous sociological theory of this. Things work well when you have maybe at least three or four distinct social networks, each of which has a particular skill set and legitimacy. And you can bring them together and make them do one unified thing. The thing they do together doesn't have to be important in its own right. In fact, it's better sometimes if it's not, right? Like, let's get together and build a sandcastle, or let's get together and make a giant horse sculpture in the desert. The power comes from being able to bring those networks together, learn the skills across networks, and gain the legitimacy that comes from exchanging legitimacy across networks. This principle of legitimacy exchange, it was pioneered by Jeff Bowker, who's a social scientist who studies science communities. It's a really important one. Legitimacy exchange argues that people from one community may have a kind of cultural standing that people in another community don't have and want. But people in that other community may have another kind of standing that this community wants. And I think that's been an enormously and powerful driver for the intersection of counterculture and computing culture. And I probably don't have to tell particularly the older folks in the room that in the 1960s, computing culture was about as low social status-wise as you got. You know, at the AI lab at MIT, they had bulletproof glass to prevent protesters from breaking in. The computer was the tool of the Cold War state. You know, when people marched for free speech in 1964 at Berkeley, they wore Hollerith cards around their neck, stamped FSI, FSB, Free Speech Berkeley, and they would chant, "I am a human being, do not fold, spindle, or mutilate." Okay, very powerful stuff. And in fact, that particular protest was sparked after Clark Kerr automated the sign-up process for classes, of all things. So in the current moment, counterculturalists have that, and have had for a long time, that kind of legitimacy. Burners have had that a long time. But they don't have the kind of social or material power that engineers have. As the Vietnam War has faded, places like Burning Man, I think, work because they bring together communities that share interests and can make trades across that legitimacy barrier. So the ones that work are the ones that do that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so on that point, one of the things that struck me about Burning Man was that how many people were there that barely used email. You know, and they just weren't, they just were not those type of people at all.
Right, interesting.
And I wasn't able to interact with those people in normal life.
Right.
And so, you know, when you were talking about commons-based production being framed as basically due to the network computer, maybe it is, but at Burning Man it felt like either it was all taken for granted that it was technology was kind of the means of bringing these people together, or it's not about the technology as much as it seems to the outside world or something. I don't know.
So I think you flagged two things that are important. First, I want to be sure that I'm clear that I don't think computers are driving the rise of commons-based peer production. Yochai Benkler does. I disagree with him, actually, on that point. I think that commons-based peer production is a new mode of industrial manufacturing that's been aborting for about 40 years. Yeah?
Did you study hackerspaces?
I haven't yet. That's actually a project I've got in the earliest stages, but I have not done that yet. Can I just finish? I want to finish with him, and I want to come back. No problem. I thought it was connected. So yeah, there are lots of different kinds of folks there. I do think two kinds of technological infrastructure are taken for granted at Burning Man. One, automobiles. You have to drive out there. It's way the heck out there. There's really no walk into the desert. Second, computers. You know, it's incredibly easy to find a computer out there. You can get online really easily, even though you're in the middle of the desert and there aren't, unless people built them, there aren't Wi-Fi links out there, and yet there somehow are. I find fascinating. There's 4 radio stations. You know, it's amazing. Okay, so I wanted to finish the question on the hackers. Did you want to have a follow-on that?
Well, just like, are you interested in that kind of stuff?
Totally. I think that, again, I would say that, like the Hacker Dojo in Mountain View, I would argue.
The director there.
Oh, can we talk afterwards?
Yeah.
Please. Okay, so I was going to say that would exemplify the new way the world is being organized from my perspective. I think it's an incredibly important development. Can we talk?
Or Maker Faire.
Pardon? Maker Faire exactly would be another example of this. Yeah. So when I showed you that slide of the 2 projects that came after my book, I was trying to choose between the old historical stuff and the new Burning Man stuff. I went with the old historical stuff. I'm halfway through a book on multimedia in the 40s and 50s. As soon as I can get that baby out the door, I want to return to the Maker Faire, the Hacker Dojo, and the contemporary world. Yeah. Yeah, it's really important. Like, I don't think there's anything more important going on right now. Yes, and then I'm going to move my way across there. Yep.
Let's see. Wait. A great talk.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
My head is absolutely buzzing with stuff.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I'll try. I'm struggling to confine it to one question. It is a vacation. It is a one or whatever it is, 1 week thing. Now there were guys, and I was a hippie in this direction. What I'm about to say, which is 1914. Getting rid of all this crap. What do we need? What do we need the czars for? What do we need? Let's have a workers' revolution, open space. Paris Revolution was another example. Man the Ramparts, and so on and so forth. And it didn't work. And so, and I guess the question I want to ask is, between a vacation mode, having a fun vacation out in the desert, and a full-time lifestyle, here it's 20% at Google. What's the right mix?
It's a great question.
Trying to get the best piece of it.
So let me reframe the question in slightly historical terms. I see a tension in America in the last 30 or 40 years between a deep personalization of everyday life, bringing our whole selves, our emotional selves, our intellectual selves, our whole beings, including the part that parties, into our whole everyday life. And another tradition that says, nah, you got to break it out. When you're in public, be your public self. When you're in private, be your private self. So for me, the question that you're asking is about how do we balance those two parts of life? And I don't have an answer to it. I'm on the one hand super excited that we are balancing it, and that parts of life that were not admissible into public discourse earlier, for example, gay life, are now available to public discourse. So available that we can actually start to legislate gay marriage. You know, that amazes me. I think that's a wonderful development. The thing I want to watch out for, and that I want to flag as a potentially pernicious development, is that when you organize labor and the distribution of real money and real goods according to social norms, you take it out of a legal register and put it into a social interpersonal register. On the one hand, that's great because you bring more of yourself. But on the other hand, what you do is you make it harder for folks who are different than you to enter the space with you. From my perspective, the problem that we face at the moment isn't how do we bring more of ourselves together, it's how do we bring more of our authentic selves together with people who are authentically unlike us. That's hard. That's really hard. And in the communities where I've traveled, Burning Man somewhat accepted, but particularly in the 60s communities there, I've spent a lot of time doing research on communes. Those are worlds where it was a lot of people like us. People like us. And if you wanted to be different than us, people would say, you know, charismatic leader would say, oh, that's just not cool, man. It's just not cool. And it's very hard to challenge that. This is why I wrote the paper in defense of bureaucracy, because I think in some settings you have to be able to challenge the distribution of resources. Yeah?
So I have friends in Switzerland, and they belong to a clique, and they spend the year working on their projects, building their art projects and their costumes, and then they have Fastnacht or Faschinger Carnival, and they have this kind of exuberance. And yet it doesn't, and so to me it's very similar to Burning Man level, but it doesn't have the same effect on Swiss society as this. And so I'm curious whether you have any opinions about why that would be so.
So it's a great question. I can't speak to Switzerland. I can speak to California. You know, meaning that the ideals that are inside Burning Man are deeply Californian ideals. They're not out of sync with the mainstream in California. On the contrary, they are the mainstream in many ways in California. California is the bohemian left coast. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it, and it's maybe a less talked about part of the story, is that Silicon Valley and the engineering world have, in the last 30 years, become project-based modes of living and working that are actually very high risk, that involve tremendous job turnover. I believe in 85, the job turnover for engineers was once every 2 years, 100% turnover every 2 years in 1985. That's incredible turnover. And if you're working for a firm in this valley, you're not going to have lifetime security, so you'd better have a strong social network. And to build a strong social network within which to seek work, you need to have a set of shared interests that aren't necessarily immediately and visibly about work. And Burning Man has a power in that dimension that other things don't. One other thing that I haven't resolved, I raise it because it parallels your question, is you know the camp of the what's it called? The wealthy camp up north of San Francisco. They gather every summer. Leaders of the globe. What is their name? The Bohemian Club. Thank you. The Bohemian Club actually has many of the features of Burning Man. They burn figures. They give each other fake names. They dress up in costumes. They have theme camps, theme houses that they live in. You know, and I just don't really know what to make of that. And then they go back to Washington and Davos. I mean, I don't really know what to make of that. But that's another question. Yeah.
Well, the other thing, you know, in the Bay Area, a lot of people live in shared houses. You have housemates.
Right.
And my experience of that is they're almost exclusively white, in the sense that a lot of people of color have very strong family connections. So why would you want to live with a bunch of strangers? And so I can sort of imagine, sort of fantasize that white people like me, who have kind of loose family ties, then gravitate to these communal experiences to gain something we're not getting from families. And people of color,
that's another really nice insight.
Strong family ties find this kind of strange and potential.
Great point. That's a great point. That's a great point. Thank you. Yeah. Was that a hand? No, that's not a hand. Okay, then I'm going to keep working across the room. Yeah, go for it. I'm coming your way. Thanks.
How do you compare the
10 principles that you just laid out for the Burning Man compared to the reality that we have rules and regulations?
In which context? The rules and regulations here outside of Burning Man or within Burning Man?
Within.
Within Burning Man. Okay, so this is, again, I think of it as almost a subsidy problem. You have the 10 principles, which are sort of an ideal inside the utopian world of Burning Man. You want them to be true, and you want to act as if they were true. It's a little bit like, it's like the 10 Commandments. You want to act in terms of the 10 Commandments, but being a fallen person, you probably don't. Okay. The structures of Burning Man that have evolved over the decades support those principles and are there to catch you when you fall. That's sort of how I think about it.
Yeah, my second question is that what had made the Burning Man idea possible is that to abolish the central government or the rule.
No, I wouldn't. I would say it was instead not to abolish a central governor or ruler, because Larry Harvey is still pretty centrally in charge, as are a series of people around him. Rather, it is to shift control from a hierarchical government to the citizens of the community working collaboratively. So it's a shift from bureaucratic management to cultural management. That's the distinction, I think. Now, I know we only go till 2, is that right? 2:05. 2:05, okay, so let me take 2 more quick questions that you guys have both patiently waited, you and you. Go for it.
How do you differentiate your work for the social analysis of Carnival and other gatherings of...
Right, so I've lately been pressed on this, thank you. I don't. You know, this is fairly unusual work for me. My work has tended to be historical and cultural historical, seeing how ideas of counterculture migrate into other communities. I'm only now really discovering work on Carnival and other very large-scale festivals. I would distinguish this kind of festival, however, from the kinds of festivals like Carnival or the Durkheim chronicled as being famously effervescent, in that the effervescence, the celebration here, is distinctly tied to a particular professional community. And I think that's an important distinction. It's not all of Rio, it's tech Rio, and filmmaker Rio, and a few other industries. Okay, great, yeah?
I love your term vocational.
Thank you.
And I'm curious if your research has ever veered at all into leadership and the impact that either going to the festival or playing some role in it has had on leadership in these.
Well, so mine hasn't. Other people have. There's work on. There's a guy named Richard Kozinets who does really, really interesting work. Parenthetically, you can find the paper that I'm speaking about today online at that website down on the bottom. You can download it. It's called Burning Man at Google. You're very, very welcome to just download it there. So Richard Kozinets has talked about that, and a number of folks believe that Burning Man is a test space for new cultural-based modes of leadership. I'm okay with that in principle and terribly anxious about it in practice, right? I mean, so again, I think it's great if we can lead in ways that respect the whole person and that bring our whole person to work. As long as we take care to reach out to those who are difficult, who are unlike us, who come with cultural assumptions that are different than ours. And that's a challenge, right? That's seriously a challenge. You know, by way of example, I'll never forget, I was at Columbia one time, and I encountered a woman who I was going to work with, and I'd been told that she would be there. That was great. I just, oh yeah, you need to meet her. And she was in full niqab. The only thing I could see were her eyes. I sucked my breath right in on that one. It was like, okay, right. And it worked, but it took a while, okay? That's the kind of challenge that I think we face. How do we do leadership in a world where people are radically unlike us? Okay. And I thank you very much for a really nice conversation. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.